My name is Ryley, and you are listening to the Ryley Heppner podcast. Well, I'll jump right in, and I do have some questions kind of
Yeah,
about your role as pastor, scholar, and the kind of relationship there.
yeah,
Uh, but can I start with this? Just why are you a New Testament scholar? Is it what has excited you, or
mhm,
excited you at the beginning, still excites you about New Testament
yeah.
scholarship?
Yeah, I would say more. I'm excited by the opportunity to train people for ministry,
Okay,
and that's why I went back to do PhD. And then New Testament wise, I would say I had a great, actually, the current dean of TEDS, Dr. David Powell. I did my MDiv here, and he
okay,
was really influential. His classes, and especially his class on Luke and writings, was it sort of really revamped how I approach reading scriptures, and
okay,
I have grown from then. But it was like it was just really, really powerful, and so that was so and I've always gravitated towards Greek versus
okay,
Hebrews, Hebrew, not Hebrews, Hebrew. Um, I feel like most people like find one
sure,
more, yeah, they affiliate with one over the other. Uh, and so it seemed to make more sense based on my interests. And
okay.
um, yeah, I mean, I enjoy the academic side of it, but I'm probably I view it very pastorally.
Okay.
And so that part is also really important to me as I think about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it.
Yeah, so I mean, because that ministry bent, being a Christian in New Testament scholarship makes a big difference to you in the scholarship.
It does. I mean, like I still write. Yeah, I mean, I would say I push against some of the guild stuff. I don't have as much interest maybe as when I started of just doing New Testament scholarship for its own sake.
Okay,
And and I tend to I gravitate towards topics or areas of study that are um going to really help the church, I think.
sure.
So like work on parables. I love to, kingdom of God stuff, like all
Okay,
that. And that it keeps me a bit more ecclesiologically oriented.
sure.
And I would say I'm more okay pushing beyond just like the traditional sort of historical critical or socio-historical critical approaches to
Yeah.
scriptures. So like talking about theology and philosophy and different things, um, I don't have any problem with that when it
Okay.
comes to scholarship.
Maybe it's a weird question, but would you have any preference and maybe you already kind of answered it even though, would you have any preference of writing to scholars versus writing to the layman, to the church?
That's a good question. I haven't been privileged enough to make that choice or have
Okay,
that choice before me. Really, um, I would say I probably going forward will write more towards people preparing for ministry,
okay,
which is a
sure.
little bit in the middle.
Yeah,
Um, and I don't have any current plans in the moment to write something that's more for just people sitting
yeah,
in the pew. It doesn't mean that it wouldn't present, an opportunity wouldn't present itself,
sure.
but
So in that pastor role, do you find a lot of just life in getting to translate scholarship to the pulpit?
yeah, I
Is
mean,
that a
as you can imagine, if you're, working on PhD stuff, right? There's most of what is the scholarship side tends to stay in the study,
sure?
and doesn't bleed into sermon, except in instances where I give like background kind of
Yeah.
stuff. Um, we're doing a Sunday school class right now that's sort of like a sermon follow-up. We call it Sermon Redux.
Okay.
Um, and so then people can ask more questions about the sermon text and dive into a little bit deeper.
Yeah.
So there, I get in, was trying to think, what yesterday did we talk about? Um, oh, we were talking that one of the Greek or the translation of this is in Luke 10. I forget, blanking on the verse 6 or 7, where it's like son of peace.
Okay.
And like the genitive there is probably, the translations that just put of in front of the genitive,
Sure.
or
Yeah.
basically like we are not taking a stand on anything. Um, and so we were talking a little bit. I was trying to talk about it without it being super technical and
Yeah.
super
Yeah.
freaky.
Yeah.
Um, but it's stuff like that I think it bleeds
Sure.
into, but it's mostly in the study rather than coming
Yeah.
out
Sure.
into the
Like
into the
in the
pulpit or
stuff that
whatever.
people aren't necessarily going to see
Yeah.
on Sunday.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the ways that I talk about, let's see, where a text is placed, where it's located in the narrative, and some of the things that seem subtle, but like they all come from a conviction about how I think the scriptures need to be interpreted,
Sure.
etc. Most pastors do that.
Yeah.
Um, Mine may be a little bit more informed at points, but
Yeah.
um, it's not super unusual in that sense.
I find that anytime I've been under the preaching of someone in biblical scholarship and then bring it to the church, I have found though, even if they don't necessarily see it, just a different kind of depth.
Mm.
So I was in a church where Ricky Watts
Oh
attended for
yeah,
a long
sure.
time,
Yeah,
and so I think he was always preaching different series, but especially when they went through Mark,
of
he
course.
was preaching, and it wasn't a heady thing. He wasn't, I don't know, trying to show his kind of scholarship muscles, but just inevitably he talked about Mark in a way that I don't know, just was so fascinating. You could see the richness there,
Mm.
even if he wasn't, technically going through Isaiah's Nuets, and talking about the Greek. And
Yeah,
I think your own colleague, I mean, Don Carson does it so well. I mean, I've been in a few churches where he's come and spoke, and he doesn't lose everyone with his headiness,
right.
but there's just, I don't know, a different depth to, you can tell that this is his
Yeah.
field.
I know my wife has said something along those lines. It's hard for me to evaluate it,
Sure.
because like
Yeah.
I'm just me,
Yep.
and but I know that we I didn't preach on the parable of the sower this series, what our associate pastor did, but next week is parable of the prodigal son, and we get into
Okay.
start to get into all the parables in Luke in the travel narrative, and so that will inevitably bring out a number of things about how I view parables and stuff, and
Sure.
so I haven't thought about how to communicate that
Yeah.
in sort of non intensive or non
Yeah.
intimidating ways, but
Yeah.
uh, yeah.
How have you found that the church complements your scholarship? Like if going the other direction, or have you found?
Yeah, I mean, I think it it keeps me tethered to what questions students need to think about.
Okay.
And it's always the so what question, right? Of like, if you're in class and you're talking about um I'm thinking more of a teaching side of it than I am scholarship side of
Sure.
it in the moment. But um I think the so what question, like how does this really matter? What does it matter for ministry? What does it matter for shepherding people who are hurting and sinners, and as we all are, right? Um and so when you're in the church and you're really hearing the questions and hearing the issues that people are wrestling with, and seeing sin and seeing the people respond to the gospel and all these, the good and the bad,
Hmm.
or good and the challenging of ministry, it keeps your what you're doing in the classroom and in your research, I think, really grounded, so
Sure.
that you're
That
not
makes
just in
sense.
this ivory tower, highfalutin sort of
Hmm.
um, way of thinking that doesn't really impact where most people are. Certainly there's a value in engaging other scholars and talking with them and all of that. But in the grand scheme of, this is my opinion, in the grand scheme
Mhm.
of the kingdom, um, it's a smaller ministry
Sure.
than most people are. Where yeah, you're hitting students and pastors and scholars versus everyone else in the church. And
Yeah. Yeah.
so
Yeah. That made sense. And I think you already kind of answered it too, but obviously your scholarship it complements your pastoral ministry.
yeah, I mean like I said, it's super easy. It's way easier right now to think about preaching Luke or
Sure.
a narrative text or any of the Gospels based on my scholarship.
Hmm.
Um, the framework that I have, the language capacity, at least if we're talking about New Testament or the Septuagint.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
you know, uh, don't tell my Old Testament colleagues about that, but um, yeah, for sure. And parables, it's funny, parables. So I've taught a class here at TEDS for parables. I've taught online, developed an online class for Covenant Theological Seminary down in St. Louis on the parables, and everyone knows about parables. Anyone in the world almost knows about like the Good Samaritan, prodigal son, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so it's fun to talk to people about parables and hear their stories about their how they've learned about them, how they understand them, and then begin to sort of probe and move the conversation forward.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of fun and interesting.
So I'm sure you'll preach on a series through the parables at some point. Hey.
Yeah, well, I mean, in Luke, we're going to go through most of them, or
Yeah.
I don't think I'm preaching on quite all of them, but most
Yeah.
of them, and that's actually both church, reasons, but also part of a book that I'd like to write would be on interpreting and preaching parables. So
Okay.
doing the both of them. If I can ever finish editing my dissertation for publication, then that would be the next project, I think.
Awesome.
And so have being able to preach through as many as I can,
Yep.
you know, feels like I need to in order to think about
Sure.
writing half of a
Yeah.
book on preaching parables.
Yeah.
And so that's really beneficial.
Well, can I start right at the beginning with parables? Could you just
Sure.
define a parable and then maybe speak
Yeah.
to just what initially even was your interest in getting into studying and writing on them?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I would say a parable, I tend to lean towards, so Elias Theon wrote one of the, um, ancient sort of rhetorical handbooks, and that was used in education and stuff in and around the first century. And he defines a fable as a story that images truth.
Okay.
And I think that most people, when they think of fable, they think like stories of like animals talking and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But the reality is, fables include a lot of fables that are just about humans and about a whole breadth of topics. And so I think a parable is, at least how we define Jesus's parables, is something that's like a fable-like account that communicates truth about God and his world and the kingdom. And so that would be my basic
Okay.
definition. So I lean into fables as the general genre into which our understanding of
Sure. Yep.
parables could be found.
That's a good connection. I've never thought of, I mean, even though the words are very similar, I never thought of parable and fable.
Yeah, and it's sort of it's weird. It's one of those increasingly I think that parabole, the Greek word, is probably a term that is sort of an umbrella term that's why it can be used in multiple situations in the Gospels for like an aphoristic sort of saying, or different things that don't seem to fit our understanding of the English word parable.
Yeah.
And I think fable is probably closer to what we understand as parable. And for example, the one I always use to sort of show what I'm talking about, or why I think this is Luke 18, 1-8, which is the parable of the um, unjust judge and the widow. And the structure of that is, what for first, it's about multiple things. Luke in his narrative sort of statement says that, Jesus wanted to teach them to pray always, or pray without ceasing. And then later in the parable itself, Jesus talks about how it's more about understanding God and God's care for his people and such things. So there's sort of two different meanings within the same parable. Um, but the statements are both line up with what in fable categories would be called what's an epimethium or promethium and epimethium. Basically, a
Sure.
statement before and after, clarifying what the fable is about.
Okay.
And that's very common, and we see that in the Gospels quite a bit with parables where there's a statement afterwards, and even if it's put into narrative, dialogue form. Uh, so I think there's a number of elements about Jesus's parables that fit best under the rubric of the fable, which was super well known in the ancient world.
Okay.
They were everywhere. Even in the Old Testament, there's some instances, the 2 Samuel 12, with Nathan and David, and other passages that lean into sort of what fables were like in the ancient
Can
world.
you find I don't know, the phonetic word of fable in old literature? Like, can you find the language of fable,
Yeah,
or just
yeah.
kind of the same paradigm?
Mythos, or often mythos or myth,
Okay. Okay.
Um, what's the other one? Gosh, I'm blanking now. It'll come to me. But
But you could trace our fables back to
yeah,
the
yeah,
ancient literature. Okay.
yep. So, I think yeah, I mean, you get Aesop's fables, Babrius, Phaedrus. There's all
Okay.
these
Okay.
collections of fables in and around the first century or earlier, and so I think what Jesus is doing is he's basically using that category more than almost anyone else. Um, but he is putting his own twist on it
Yeah.
at times. And, so there's a few that feel a bit more, and I think that impacts, how you interpret them.
Yeah.
Most fables weren't allegorical. There
Okay.
were a few that were, but most were largely not. They had a point or two that they were trying to communicate. That's the promethium and epimethium before.
Okay.
Um, so okay, that helps with a lot of the parables. I mean, there's only three parables that have an explanation after, or a few that have an explanation after them that seems allegorical,
Okay.
right? The sower, the wheat and the weeds, and the what's the one in Mark 4? The parable of the growing seed, right? And so I think, anyways, tangent. I'm getting off, but it's
Oh, that's really interesting.
yeah. So I think it's
This is probably a
something that,
silly question, but
yeah.
I mean, even the language of parable, I haven't heard or read about much. I haven't looked necessarily, but parables outside of the Gospels. Like, did Jesus really kind of develop his own thing, or is he just adopting a pattern that's all around him?
I would say he is more adopting a pattern,
Okay.
or at least a genre that was available to him.
Okay.
Um, Sort of like the gospel writers adopted a genre of, biography,
Sure.
probably, and then adapted it um, to suit their own purposes. But he is definitely using it way more, at least we get narratives of him using them more than we have narratives or accounts of other people using them.
Okay.
Um, I mean, there were lots of teachers going around and different things, whether they were, teaching with fables as much as Jesus does with parables. We don't have accounts of it as much,
Okay.
except for Aesop, really. And even then, that account the life of Aesop, for example, um, is a lot different than what you get in the Gospels.
Okay.
And yeah, so I would say that Jesus is fairly unique in his use of them and how often he employs them. And and there's always good questions about why. Why does he use parables so much? From a rhetorical perspective, what do parables do and how they communicate
Yeah.
that it sort of requires them compared to other forms of communication that Jesus uses, just like a normal, speech or something like
Sure.
that.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting that, I mean, he must have heard parables growing up and for some reason
Yeah.
latched onto that as this would be a really powerful teaching tool or
Yeah, and I think it's some of it is there is a metaphorical-ish sort of bent towards parables. And metaphors are always used, because they communicate something that can't really be articulated in the same way if you're just using non-metaphorical
sure.
language, right? And so, there's something about parables that helps Jesus communicate,
Yeah.
quote unquote. I mean, not that Jesus needs help, you know what I'm saying,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. For sure.
he's able to communicate in a way that people can really grasp the idea or the concept or the topic
Yeah.
in a way that they probably couldn't as well without a parable.
But then the funny thing about that is that then, at times they know, it's,
Yeah, it's still over their heads.
and
Uh,
even the disciples or they're the only ones that get it or
yeah, and I think that's, I mean, if you think about it, though, there's a number of topics that are common to parables that aren't as common to other aspects of Jesus' teaching, like the kingdom, for example. I
sure.
think it's because the kingdom is a difficult topic, a concept to really understand.
Yeah.
And so putting them into something that has a bit more of a story aspect to it
Yeah.
allows for people to really grasp it better.
Yeah. That's a good
But
point.
yeah, you're right. They still don't get it often. And we
So
don't either.
what was it originally about parables that kind of drew you in?
Yeah, I was I've long been interested in the kingdom
Okay.
and um and not as I just had questions about what it is, what it means. And so I was starting to do some work on it and thinking, and obviously naturally you gravitate towards some of the parables. And so I wrote an article on the parable of the mustard seed and leaven in Luke. And then so that was my first foray into it.
Okay.
And then as I was teaching Gospels and some other New Testament texts, and I just began to see like, oh, I've done a good amount of work on parables, but like every time I talk to a student or someone about parables, like I get 12 different answers, and it's like everyone has a different like they learned, what this X parable means,
Hmm.
that's different to someone else's church, and so there just seemed to be a lot of questions, if
Sure.
not confusion, about what parables are, what do they mean, how is Jesus using them, and so that really piqued my interest,
Okay.
and still does because every time I teach a parables class, I almost always start with like, well, what do you think parables are, and you know, uh, and how do we understand them and interpret them? And I get like 12 answers, 12 different answers from 12 different students, it seems like, because um, so I think there is a lot of despite the fact that they're taught really well, actually, that's not true. I have also gravitated towards or heard from students recently that they don't hear parables taught as frequently. You get
Sure.
the greatest hits, right? The
Yeah.
Good Samaritan, Prodigal Son, um, must maybe a few other Parable of the Sower. But after that, like
Yeah. We're staying away from kind of the more complex ones.
because people don't understand them,
Hmm.
and so all of that led to me being like, oh, that's interesting. Maybe I should read a little bit more, and started reading more and study more, and then yeah, ended up teaching a class, several classes on them, and that was really
Okay.
the impetus for the research and study.
You sought out the class or did they approach you and be, would
I
you like to?
I think I offered to, I was asked to teach a class here at TED's on, it's advanced Greek exegesis.
Okay.
And I said, I'll do it, but I want to do it on parables, which had never been
Oh,
done. Usually
interesting.
it's like stick to like a short Pauline epistle or something.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
um, so that was the impetus. But then it turned out I was asked to teach an undergrad class on parables and
Okay.
then another grad at the Covenant class to develop and teach. And so
Okay.
it was like in a year span, I taught three different classes
Okay.
on three different levels, basically on parables. And all of that was sort of the launching pad for it.
Okay. Oh, that's neat. So
Yeah.
almost, I mean, in a way, kind of stumbled into becoming a
Yeah.
kind of expert on parables.
Yeah, I never like thought, oh, I'm gonna work on parables.
Yeah.
It was more Kingdom and Luke, and I did stuff on the Ascension, of course, but now then my dissertation was more on authority and politics in the ancient world, and so yeah, I never really thought about parables until I started diving into it for a class.
A testimony to what you're saying about like kind of avoiding parables, I think is, I mean, my observation has been, or my experience has been a lot of scholars that I've encountered, in the church teaching or preaching often is on parables.
Interesting.
Don Carson in particular, I feel like each time I've heard him, he's been speaking on parables, especially I think a few times on the rich man and Lazarus and
Oh, sure. Yeah.
stuff like that, but teaching on these passages that I think are avoided because they're kind of, I don't know, weird
They're
and
just
complex.
difficult,
And what do we do? And
Right.
I mean, how do we understand the rich man and Lazarus? Like,
Yeah.
are they
Or
actually
the
talking? And
unjust steward in Luke 16, that's always
yeah, yeah,
a really difficult one, but I'll let you know how that goes when I get there.
yeah. Well, I look forward to reading the book when it inevitably comes out one day. Well,
Me too.
what do you think the most common errors are, the ones you encounter in your classes, common errors about, or maybe even that you've heard from the pulpit of interpreting, understanding parables? Are there like clear kind of things that we get wrong right from the beginning often?
A few things. I think one is harmonization.
Okay.
So, it's like, hey, parable of sower is in, or I'll take the parable of mustard seed and leaven, it's in all three synoptics. At least Mark doesn't have the leaven, but Matthew, and harmonization is a problem because some of these parables occur in different narrative settings
Sure.
in a different gospel. So the mustard seed and leaven in Luke is in Luke 13. It's not it's not like Matthew 13 or Mark 4 where it's sort of a series of parables,
You're
right?
saying our problem is that we try to harmonize them?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So it's like, oh, I'm going to preach on the parable of the mustard seed and leaven, and then I'm going to just squash it all,
Yeah.
three gospels version into one.
Sure. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
which on the one hand is sort of okay because I assume they don't mean wholly different things,
Yep.
but Jesus uses parables probably multiple times in multiple different settings, not always for the same reason.
Yeah.
So that harmonization would be one. Not paying attention to, yeah, where the narrative, what Joel Green calls the narrative context, so the
Okay.
various passages right in and around it, and how that really informs what is going on with the parable and why it's there and why the gospel author has gospel writers included it there. So usually those are things that when students think about it, they're like, oh yeah, that's important, but they don't actually think about it until after they're
Sure.
prompted.
Yeah.
Um,
I feel like probably often when parables are being preached on, because you treat them as like this individual little story, I don't know that too many are thinking about context.
yeah,
Because it's
yeah,
like, I mean, the mustard seed, it's like, okay, well, it doesn't matter what comes after or before. This is just about the
great.
mustard seed.
Yeah, for sure. The other thing I think is allegory or
Okay.
allegorization. Everyone wants to allegorize a parable.
Okay.
And I think I'm still a bit uncertain about whether it's appropriate at all,
Okay.
or if it's only appropriate for a select few parables,
Okay.
like the ones that have an sort of allegorical like explanation.
Yeah.
And, but the rest that don't, I think should not be understood as allegories.
Okay.
And so those are probably the big ones that I see. that I'm just like, let's take a step back and ask why we have these presuppositions
Yeah.
about interpreting parables that way.
Would you think Jesus made some fair assumptions as he was teaching parables that his context, his listeners understood things about hearing and interpreting parables that we don't, even though once in a while they missed it or
I mean, I'm sure they did, but even the ones, I mean, I always think about the parable of the sower. I mean, the disciples don't even understand that on its own
yeah,
terms
yeah,
and have to ask for an explanation.
that's true.
And yet I find I personally find it hard to believe that Jesus would have given the parable of the sower and not expected anyone to understand it without the explanation.
Sure.
Um, and if that's the case, if someone could have understood the parable of the sower without the explanation, then it becomes a question of, well, is it really allegorical? Do you
Yeah,
need that other set of information and knowledge to really understand, which is required for allegory? And almost always in allegories, you have to have a common set of target information or target um, knowledge for the allegory to actually work.
sure.
So it's like I'm talking to you about surfing and you don't even know what surfing is. And I'm using that as expecting you to understand that the allegory is about surfing. Well, that just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah,
It's going to be nonsensical to you.
yeah,
So the question is, does he expect everyone to have this encyclopedia of understanding to then filter the parable through allegorically?
yeah,
And I think that's a lot to ask
sure.
of everyone who's hearing Jesus
Yeah.
speak.
Yeah. Would you say there are simpler and more difficult parables? Like, are there any that are like, this is an easy parable? I don't like
Uh,
the, I don't know, the treasure in the field or something, or,
yeah, I think some of those smaller kingdom parables are fairly straightforward.
okay.
I think that even the lost coin, lost sheep, and to an extent, the prodigal son, although what people with the prodigal son forget about is the second half of the parable that isn't about the
Yeah.
younger son at all.
Yeah.
Um, those are, t- the excuse me, the Luke 18:9 to 14 with the Pharisee and tax collector. Those are fairly straightforward, right?
Okay.
I think there are some that are really difficult. We already mentioned the unjust steward in Luke 16. Um, some of them, honestly, are really difficult because of how familiar everyone is with them.
Okay.
And they come with a whole set of assumptions, like the Good Samaritan
Yeah.
or the sower. And so it's difficult in a different way because of that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that made sense. And I mean, the prodigal son, I feel like is a classic where
Yeah.
even the title prodigal son, I don't know where we coined that, but
Yeah.
misses the whole, as you say, second half of the
Yeah. Yeah. And even
message.
people not in the church know about that parable and
Yeah.
use language like that or the Good Samaritan language like that in
Yeah.
everyday discourse that but they don't really know what the parables are about.
Yeah. Well, you've written on the mustard seed. What would you say what do Christians commonly get wrong in their interpretation of that parable?
I think probably assuming the kingdom is about growth
Okay.
in the sense that um I think the parable is more about uh, the end completion of the change, the transformation
Okay.
from a seed to a tree, rather than like it's the kingdom is in this progressive, progress from small to great.
Yeah.
And part of that is also like Old Testament understanding of the kingdom, like God was already king in the Old Testament and he's king over everything. And so how does that inform what Jesus is trying to communicate about the kingdom in a way that's not contradictory to the fact that God is king already
Yeah.
You know, as though the kingdom in when Jesus gets there is this something tiny, small thing, and therefore it's got to grow
Yeah,
and
that's a good point.
expand. Um, so I think that's probably the biggest thing.
Okay. So how would you can you just refine or define a little more how what how would you so you would see the mustard seed as almost like having a judgment aspect?
It does have that, and it does have most parables have a judgment aspect to them,
Okay.
which I think is part of why people don't preach on them as much because
Yeah.
they do have a harshness to them at
Okay.
points. Um, yeah, Jesus does not mince words when he
Yeah. Yeah, you
when he
definitely don't I don't associate the parables with a harshness. But when I read your article on the mustard seed, I was kind of blown away by.
they have an edge to them. Even the parable of the sower, right? If you think about it, three-quarters of the seed
Yeah.
does not end up very well.
Yep.
And so when you start thinking about it from that perspective, you're like, oh, that's not as happy of a story as we might think it is.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think the mustard seed. What was your question? I'm sorry, Riley, I forgot.
Oh yeah, just like talking about what we get wrong about it, but what would be like a healthy interpretation of the mustard seed? And you kind of already said like less about a slow growth and more about the end and
Yeah, and that the fact that the kingdom is going to, uh, the world is going to be transformed. The kingdom is, going to come to its culmination, where there will be everything renewed, etc. So I think there's a hope aspect to it.
okay.
Um, and I think that fits in the context of where it's situated in Luke, at least in Luke, right? In Luke 13, where you get right after the woman who's been bent over for so long and has been bound by Satan, as the narrative says, and now she's been freed, and there's this sort of sense of that's not growth. That's just like a um, wow, you know we've reached a completely different place
Sure.
where, man, okay, it's gone from this small thing that uh, yes, there's impact here and now. It doesn't feel as much of it, but one day it will be this, large tree where birds nest in it, and it's
Yeah.
going to be everything will be transformed.
Yeah. You know, with
Which
the harsh
it's
oh
subtle.
sorry.
It seems like growth, but it's not quite the same thing.
Yeah. No, I see the and again when I read your article, seeing that differentiation, because I would have been in the category that always interpreted as kingdom's a little seed, it's
Yeah,
gonna be a tree. Look at how it relentlessly keeps growing.
right, right.
I probably
And that's
preached on that at
that's
some
I
point.
guess that would be a fourth thing that people with parables, they like to fill in gaps in the parable.
Okay.
Um, that usually if the gap is there, just because it's not important.
Yeah.
And in our modern ways of thinking, we want to fill in gaps. We want to fill in like the details so that we know all,
Yeah.
it's our scientific modernist way of thinking.
Yeah.
Um, but parables don't function that way, and it's fine. We don't need
That's a
all the
really
gaps.
good point. I mean, especially with the prodigal son, I feel like we try and tell the whole story.
Yeah,
Like what was he doing out there? And he was meeting
right.
these people and
Despite the fact that the parable ends with not knowing whether the older son responds appropriately or not.
yeah,
We have no idea if
that's a good point.
if he, which I think is rhetorically like that's the part of the point. It's like,
Sure.
well, you've just heard this. How do you respond here?
Yeah.
You know?
Yep.
Um, yeah, they're fun. Parables, super fun.
With the harshness, it's funny that so often it seems like the ones who it is harsh for are there. Like with the prodigal son, I mean,
Yeah,
they're
yep,
standing there grumbling, or even with this the sower, I would feel like as he's being like a lot of these seeds. I mean, that's probably a lot of Jews standing there hearing
yeah,
that, like, oh, even we're not in.
yeah. I think he, but use so if you were to say the same, if you understand the parable having an edge to it,
Yeah.
right, a judgment edge, and you were just to teach that in a non-parabolic sort of form, it's way harsher, and you're going to
Sure.
get way, not that Jesus avoids criticism at all,
Yeah.
but um, people are going to shut down and not
Hmm.
hear faster than if you use a story.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the beauty of parables, that they still have that edge to them, but um, it doesn't hit people in the same way, and it gets people thinking about it rather
Yeah.
than just rejecting it immediately.
Yep.
Um, but it's sort of
Yeah.
like a good illustration in a sermon does,
Sure.
in theory.
I mean, he doesn't even have to name them.
Right. He didn't have to use the word judgment or anything like that, or
Yeah.
yeah, or say, "Hey,
Be like,
you."
you're the older son, or
Right, right. He just uses it in a way. Same with like the wicked tenants in Luke 19. I mean, they
sure.
knew that the parable was directed to them,
Yeah.
but he
Yeah.
didn't directly say that.
Yeah. Yeah. In some ways, then he's you know,
He's like,
kind of innocent.
it's wisdom. I think there's some wisdom in that.
Yeah.
At least, as he's trying to do his ministry. I mean, he knows he's where he's going in terms
Yep.
of cross, but uh, it does allow him probably to not get to the cross as quite as fast
Yeah.
as if he was just directly
Sure.
calling. I mean, he still does that. He's right. He still calls him out, but
Yeah.
not in every context.
But yeah. Would you say like Jesus generally preaches in a like a more indirect way than even like Peter and Stephen and some of these
Yeah,
Acts messages where it's like you did this to him and
I think so, but I think that again, it comes down to um, well, yeah, I do think it's interesting that most post resurrection, teachers and preachers do not use parables. I think there's sort of a reverence for what Jesus did
okay,
in parables, that you don't see any of them using them.
sure,
At least we don't have any record of them using them hardly at all. Uh, but I do think that, yeah, Jesus was trying to winsomely and wisely
yeah,
engage his hearers, and using parables, I think, allowed him to do that in certain ways.
yeah, that's a good point. I mean, interesting that Paul never seems to utilize a
Yeah,
parable
very
or
rarely do you see anything that approaches it. And part of it's genre, like letters aren't as appropriate, or
sure, yeah,
it's not as typical to put a parable in a letter. Um, Perhaps because explanation is helpful and
okay,
needed at
yeah.
times. Um, so
Well, I think relatedly, can I ask you this? We already talked about order a little, but why would you say that the gospel writers order their sequence of events differently? And I suppose maybe the common interpretation of that, does that discount their accounts at all, that they're moving
yeah.
things around? And I think specifically just because you wrote about it, you pointed out the differences in the temptation
Hmm.
narratives, which never picked up on
Yeah.
before.
Yeah, I think that the gospel, it does not discount it at all. I think
Okay.
that they were just writing according to good, conventions of the day.
Okay.
They, in terms of either historiography or biography, they did not, obviously, have modernist understandings of history writing or biography writing like we do today, where, we are very concerned today to get it all in order as it
Yeah.
actually happened,
Yeah.
right? Which
Yeah.
is still like there are assumptions behind that make it seem like that's fully objective, and
Yeah.
postmodernity has sort of exposed a lot of that, right? It's like, well, there's still a perspective there,
Yeah.
of the one who is of the biographer or of the historian, and that's actually okay. It's not inaccurate. It doesn't nullify it, um, despite what people want to argue. Uh, but back in the first century, that those conventions, that way of thinking uh, was not there, and
Okay.
so it's very they were very comfortable with putting things in the order that served their larger narratological and rhetorical purposes.
Okay.
And that was considered good historiography, good biography.
Okay.
It wasn't considered bad
Okay.
back in the day. In fact, it would have been weird if the people didn't do it that way.
Okay.
And so I don't think it discounts it at all. I think it just is like, hey, Luke and Mark and Matthew and John, we're just trying to. I mean, John is in a different category of sorts, but
Mhm.
um, they were just trying. They were operating well under the conventions of the day.
Yeah, so they really felt like they had a license. I mean, they might not have even thought about it, just assumed like I can
Yeah, yeah.
move
They
these
would not have
around.
thought of it as a license. They would have
Okay.
thought of it like this is just what everyone does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, I'm sure
Just
we do
as
this a
just as
lot.
we think today of if someone sits down to write a history of something, well, today everyone writes history in a certain way,
Yeah.
and so I'm going to write it that way. I'm not going to write it in this other way.
Yeah. And I feel like if things are out of order nowadays, we would discount like,
Yeah.
I mean, if I could picture like someone getting mugged and then you go and if your account is a little mixed
Right.
up, then clearly you're lying here.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so that modernist way of thinking was completely unknown to first century writers.
I'm sure there's a lot of ways that you could think of that we apply modern notions to reading
Yeah.
gospel narratives that don't help us.
Yeah. I think we make a lot of assumptions. A good example is not coming to my mind at the moment,
Sure.
but
Yeah, no problem.
um, for sure, absolutely.
Uh with the Matthew Luke kind of rearrangement of the temptation
Yeah.
narratives, could you just comment on, again, you've written on it, but comment on why they do
Mm.
this? They're free to do it. What's kind of
Yeah.
helped in their individual narratives by doing that?
Yeah, I think Luke, so Matthew obviously has the last temptation being the one about authority, etc. And Luke puts that in the middle one. And for a long time, it was always assumed that Luke wanted to end the temptation account in Jerusalem, where Jesus is on the temple summit and is being tempted to because of the travel narrative progressing towards Jerusalem, and so scholars just sort of thought, oh, this is what Luke does, right? But the reality is, I think Luke has structured it in a way to put the center temptation as the main one, using chiasm or um, even if he didn't think about it in that term, there was other rhetorical ways of organizing a text so that you could progress towards a point and then progress back, and so I think they're merely just using different rhetorical strategies to accomplish the same purpose. Matthew, by ending it with the temptation on, I've been talking about parables too much. The temptation on the authority, and then Luke saying, "Oh, I'm going to structure it in a different rhetorical with a different rhetorical strategy
Sure.
by putting it at the center."
Who do you think has the I don't know, the most accurate order of events? Like, does it seem like Luke with his introduction was
Oh, in
especially
terms of
key
the
to that?
gospel as a whole,
Okay.
in terms of the gospel as a whole, is that what you're
Oh
asking?
yeah, is like if we were trying to really line up the order of events with chronology, a
Probably,
precise chronological order would
if we were
would
going to
it
go
be?
pure chronology, I mean, both Matthew and Luke tend to align with Mark because Mark is much shorter and doesn't have stuff uh, nearly as much content as Matthew and Luke do. But I would say Mark and Luke would be 1A,
Okay.
1B, depends on what portion we're talking about. There's a good amount in Luke's travel narrative that Mark just doesn't have.
Okay.
And so I think, but I would go Luke, I guess.
And it seems like John is just doing his whole
He's
own
just doing a
thing.
different thing.
Okay.
Totally. It's very different.
Yeah. It's interesting. Well, hey, getting to the end of an hour here, so I don't want to
Yeah.
keep you long. I'm sure do you have classes today even?
No classes today. I have plenty of meetings though.
Okay. Okay. Well, can I ask you a few just kind of personal
Yeah,
questions?
of course.
Well, my I would be interested in this as a New Testament scholar. How confident are you that the words written in the Gospels are historically reliable? I know we can't assume that anymore of all New Testament scholars.
Yeah, I think they're historically reliable, as they were intended to be understood
Okay.
within ancient historiographical conventions.
Yeah.
And ultimately their purpose is to show Jesus as Lord and Savior, Son of God, all those things. And so they are less concerned with being with, like we talked about, fitting within modernist conventions of
Sure.
history,
Yeah.
and more with presenting Jesus as he needs to be understood by by hearers.
Yeah. So a journey into scholarship hasn't cast more doubts in your mind on, hasn't shaken your
Mhm.
faith more than
No,
going
because
in.
no, because I increasingly, see how many assumptions and presuppositions scholars uh, bring to their scholarship
Okay.
that sadly they just don't own, or they do own but don't state. And so, when people make claims about, so someone might, they haven't done this about me, but someone like myself who would not see it as problematic. Yeah, it's like, well, their own interpretations have a lot of problems
Sure.
and holes, and especially when it comes to philosophy and theology, that you just can't. They're trying to do it in a very modernist way, right?
Okay.
But modernity and how modernity thinks has some problems to it. Likewise, postmodernity, if we're going to go like reader response criticism or something like that, where so a lot of it has to do with objectivity and subjectivity and how we embrace both of those together rather than over emphasizing one or the other.
Okay.
And then we get super philosophical and you start getting into Heidegger and other stuff and it gets crazy. And I start to be like, I don't understand any of this. And
Sure.
I'm not smart enough for that. I have friends that are smart enough to
Sure.
read Heidegger, um, but I think, yeah. So no, the short answer is
Yeah.
not uh, in any way impacted my faith.
Have you found that deeper study has deepened
Hmm.
faith in Christ?
Yeah, I think, excuse me, probably not as much as certain aspects of it have. Like
Okay.
work on when you work with Jesus, it's hard not to, you know, think about stuff. My understanding of the kingdom, understanding of the authority of Jesus, and um, even things like, excuse me, you're working with Jesus in on authority. It's like, oh, there's all this stuff about angels and other things that are like, oh, I would never have thought much about God's world and creatures and creation in a much more, super mundane way
Okay.
if I hadn't done some of the work that I'd done.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like maybe like pastoral ministry. I find like I wouldn't study scripture as much, but my job pushes me into it,
Yeah,
which I'm thankful
absolutely.
for. That kind of
Absolutely. Yeah. And I do
brings you
at
into
least
spaces.
I I do a pretty good job of separating out my work in the word, right?
Yeah. Sure.
And my own personal, study of it to just for my own spiritual edification
Okay.
and sanctification. So I'm thankful for that. Not everyone, I think, does that, but for me, that's the Lord has been gracious in that way.
Okay. Most impactful books that in your life or in your career
Oh gosh.
or any
Um,
that stand out as
most there's so many
I
probably.
know that's too big of a question.
Um,
How about
it's
lately?
like
Anything you've been reading that's been
I would say well, a couple of new books that are really, really good. Helen Bond, her book on, I think it's called The First Biography of Jesus
Okay.
on Mark.
Okay.
Really helpful about biography in the first century and how it relates. Really, really good.
Okay. Helen Vaughn.
Um, there's a great book. It's super expensive on fables, and I think it's called The Fables of Jesus by what is his name? I've been carrying around with me forever. Why can't I remember his name? Fables of Jesus by
Okay.
Justin. I want to say Justin something. It'll come to me.
But bringing together exactly what you were talking about, fables and parables and
Yeah, he's done a ton of work. I don't agree with everything about how
okay.
he gets into sort of some critical scholarship of the Gospels and Q and different things, and I find it less helpful when he goes that direction.
Okay.
But his work on fables and then showing how Jesus's parables, have a lot of the similar elements
Okay.
is really helpful. But it's also very technical and very expensive.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
not
as
for
there was
not for the average person to delve
yeah,
into.
fair enough. There are some of
Uh,
those real niche books that uh I'm in the middle of trying to finish a thesis right now
mm,
and from like distant. So
mm,
at Trinity Western University, but I'm about
okay.
5 hours away and
Yeah.
stumble upon a book that's not digitized on the library. That's like their what's the latest one? Kelly Iverson on
Oh,
Gentiles in Mark.
oh
And you go
yeah.
on Amazon and it's just like $350. I don't under some of those
Yeah.
kind of obscure books just maybe because they're printed so with some few copies. I don't know, but
Yeah. I mean, they're basically like, here, libraries, you buy this book. Thank you.
oh,
And
that's a good point. Yeah,
yeah. But
obviously it's not made for the average Amazon consumer.
no, no.
What? How about? Can you give me one book in your just kind of devotional life that's been impactful through whether early on or
Yeah,
later?
right
Or,
now, I really appreciate the Every Moment Holy books. Have you heard of
no,
those?
never heard.
Gosh, now see, I can't remember his name either. There's three volumes. They're
Okay,
basically like liturgies for different life moments.
okay. Every moment
Even
holy.
yeah, Every Moment Holy.
Okay,
And they're beautifully done. They're really great. Um, there was also see it's at home. I tend to have to look at it to see it.
sure. Yeah.
I would say Kelly Kapic, Kapic, his book
Okay.
called You're Only Human
Okay.
is a really, really great book. He teaches down at Covenant College
Okay.
in Lookout Mountain, Georgia. Um, so there's definitely some really solid books about that one is like anthropology and thinking about what it means to be human.
Okay.
I think a lot of books like that. There's another one. No, it's not here. I think there's a number of books along those lines that have been coming out that are, at least for ministry and
Yeah.
with how younger generations are thinking about what it means to be human,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, oh, what is that? Oh, that's one. Kevin Van Hooser, Dr. Van Hooser, who teaches systematic theology here. Um, Ian Provon's book on, I want to say it's called Cuckoos in the Nest, I think.
Okay.
It's a super strange title, but it's basically like
I think I
how,
might have just heard someone mention that.
yeah, really helpful about getting at some of these. What is the core question of the day?
Okay.
And he thinks anthropology is also, most under fire
Okay.
when it comes to, and that cuckoos have snuck into the nest in the church to really undermine how we ought to think about what it means to be human.
Okay.
So really, yeah, really good.
Okay. I'll have to check those out. I appreciate the
Yeah.
recommendations. Dr. Bryan, just thank you for your time and thanks for being willing to chat about these things and unpack them. And
Yeah. Ryley, thanks so much for the opportunity and blessings on your ministry.